narratives in games, and then after like doing a general thing about how you should be planning narratives in your games and like branching and stuff like that, and going on into focus on like visual novels specifically. So I hope y'all stay around for like all of that. So basically, like there's a lot of different types of narratives in games. Well, this is so like for example in Detroit Become Human, or like a lot of RPGs and a lot of mobile games too. I'll like have different styles of kind of bring the narrative in there, but a really common one is kind of like the text boxy stuff with the sprites or like the visual novel style. And a lot of games are basically like all of that. For example, like Ace Attorney or like Danganronpa. Except surprisingly enough, like as far as the visual novel community goes, games like Ace Attorney and like Danganronpa technically aren't considered visual novels. Like there's even an entry on like the NDB, which is the visual novel database, which is like we are putting this here because people keep on trying to say that this is a visual novel. This is not a visual novel because it's like a detective game or whatever. And of course, among those like narrative-based games that have like actual gameplay, there are also just like visual novels and like drawing games and stuff like that, and the text-based stuff. Basically, I don't know how many of y'all have story ideas that you want to like actually put into your games. But before you do, like try to implement the story and all that, like you have to take the scope knife to your idea and cut it down, because honestly, like even if you have like an amazing epic in mind, if you can't implement it, then the epic just doesn't really turn out to be anything. So even if you think like, wouldn't it be cool if they had this XYZ scene? Well, you have to think about, well, if I added that scene, what would happen? But I had to draw that sprite in that background and then write a whole nother scene, and then like the gameplay stuff, you have to like add other stuff too. So please keep in mind the scope whenever you're planning your story. And also it's probably important for you to also keep in mind the scope while you're making a game, since I'm sure that like everyone gets better ideas as you start making it. Like, it would be cool if we added this thing now that we have this, but please don't overdo it. And then whenever you get something big done and then you need to move on to the next step, take the scope knife and cut it down, or else your game will never get finished. But once you have like something in mind, you can start writing, or you can start outlining, planning. I'm not really going to tell you if you should be outlining and planning, because some people write better without like having the outline and stuff like that. Like y'all are pantsers. But some writing softwares that are pretty good are things like Scrivener. And right now, so NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month, is going on. And if you finish NaNoWriMo, or like you kind of cheat and say that you finished NaNoWriMo, you can get like a pretty big discount off of Scrivener and like some other writing apps. So I recommend you check it out if you're interested. And of course, there's Google Docs, which I'm sure everyone knows how to use. And like even though it's a very simple and kind of basic, like the cloud saving stuff and being easy to share with like teammates is very convenient. So no problem if you just stick with Google Docs for your writing stuff. But for narrative games, one of the biggest highlights is, of course, the branching. And there are three ways I'll be showing you on how you could branch and like plan your branching in your games. Since I'm guessing that a lot of y'all will still like be designed to outline and plan things if you do happen to want to add narratives. So first off is to use like note cards, paper, and pen or pencil, because like so the method is basically to write out mini scenes on like each note card, and then you can move it around very easily to connect it and stuff like that, like physically on your desk or paper or whatever, which is nice for some people. But I know like a lot of people don't really like having a bunch of paper clutter on their desk. But there are also like free programs that are very useful for like adding branching and choices. So there's Twine, which is like in and of itself kind of like a program that you can make narrative games in, but it's like very text based, which Well, I don't know about you, but I like having pictures in my games. So at least as far as it goes, it's also like just very useful for making like branching outlines, as you can kind of just like see from this picture I have here of someone using Twine. And if you want something a little bit more sophisticated, there's also something called Artisy Draft, except so like it's pretty good for making like branching stories and outlines and stuff like that. But the downside is it costs money, and as it turns out, whenever you want to make games, and it turns out the thing that you want costs money, it's always kind of expensive. So I think Artisy Draft right now is like $100. So would not recommend unless like you're totally sure that you're into it. I think there is a free demo that you can try out or something like that. So if you have the time and you're interested in trying it out, would recommend anyways. Yeah. But if you are deciding to make use of these things and add choices and branching into your game, you have to make your choices count. Because honestly, if you have shitty choices, it's worse than just not having any choice at all. So when it comes to branching, I think here are like major 5 things you can keep in mind. So the types of branching that you can have, well, there's like the stats based type, which is like having stat checks, for example. Those are pretty common in things like raising sims, dating sims, like honestly anything with like stats and numbers that you can be like, I have this stat, I like passed the test or whatever. But of course, like not all narratives are completely stat based because sometimes they're just like major turning points in the game. So there are also major event based games like did you ask the girl out? If you didn't ask the girl out, well, it doesn't matter what your stats are because you're not dating her because you didn't ask her out. And of course, there's also like flavor text type things. Since, like, for example, I don't think Pokemon does this, but in a lot of RPGs, there are those sections where you're not really gonna change any of the story because the story of the RPG is like become strong, get comrades, defeat the demon lord. But like you get to say like funny things to different characters. So flavor text branching is also pretty nice because it's like world building. But if you do have branching, well, depending on the amount of branching you have, like please have adequate numbers of save files because like I mentioned Pokemon, but Pokemon doesn't really have choices that really like branch the story because there is no branching story. So it's okay that it has like literally one save file and you just overwrite it over and over again. And you have to delete it when you make a new save file and character. But if you're like playing a game and you've gone through like half the game and then you make a stupid choice and there's only one save file and then you didn't save scum properly, like I think your player will be pretty pissed at you if it turns out they have to basically replay the whole game because they overloaded the one save file that you gave them. So please have lots of save files. And when you have rinsing, it's I know that you should be playtesting your game no matter like if your game has like branching and narratives, but with like branching and narratives, like please have other people playtest it and read it through so that the story makes sense because it's also like the players will not be able to get into the story anymore if you have scenes like after passing a stat test, your character goes into XYZ, but you're writing thinks that, oh, well, story wise, the character may not have done that. So I'll just act like they didn't do it. And then the player will be like, what the fuck are you doing? This does not make sense. So branching don't have inconsistent narratives like that. And also, when it comes to choices, don't have the player feel like their choices don't matter. For example, like if the player chooses to do XYZ, but then the game is like, nope, the player did not do XYZ, then there's a high chance that the player will feel like they don't have any agency and they'll get like kind of sick of your game and be like, this game sucks. I don't like it. So yeah. And in that same vein, if you have like a bunch of frustrating dead end or bad ends like in your narrative, it's not exactly super great depending on the difficulty of your game intended and also like how interesting those bad ends are. Because if your game just kind of like pigeonholes your player into one thing over and over again, no matter what the player does. The player will eventually also get frustrated and be like, screw this game. This game isn't fun anymore. I'm not playing it. Like that type of thing. But of course, as with all games, there are people who do like having the frustration stuff. So that part's like kind of dependent on the intended difficulty of the game. And of course, also over here, so I don't know if y'all have played Fate Stay Night or anything like that, but Fate is like one of those games where there's a lot of frustrating dead ends and bad ends from things like on the third day you did not flirt with your underclassmen, so then she got really sad, and then like 5 days later you die. But the thing with it is that like they added some interesting fun like kind of like blooper segment at the end. At one, they tell you how you got into the bad end so you can avoid the bad end and like get out of the whole like, oh no, I'm stuck doing the same thing over and over again and dying over and over again thing. And also like bloopers are fun and it'll like make it so the player will be interested in the bad end. Although I talked this much about branching, branching is not actually necessary. So I mentioned before that a lot of RPGs don't really have like super branching path when it comes to the storytelling. Like they have like the flavor text type stuff, but like the story is pretty linear. As long as your story is good, your narrative is like good. Because well, while there are people who are like, if your story doesn't give me choices to branch places, then this game sucks. Well, you're not necessarily like aiming your game towards those people anyways. So whether or not you want to branch is up to you. And as I mentioned before, scope. Like branching is something that adds like a lot of work onto the story, so only branch if necessary, even though like branching is fun. But if you do branch, try to keep in mind the tips that I gave. And that's for kind of like the general thing on like narratives, making a narrative in your story game, like in general. But now I will be going into visual novels, which is the thing that I make. Hurrah! So I've talked about the writing mostly. Within visual novels, there are the fully linear games and also the branching games. Even though you might think of VN that's like the choose your own adventure types thing, but there are a lot of visual novels that are actually fully linear. So within the visual novel community, the fully linear ones are called kinetic novels, while the branching ones, well, I think they're just generally called visual novels because there's still the expectation that visual novels have choices. But I mostly covered the like writing, branching, linear stuff. So as far as visual novels and narrative games go, it's more or less the same. But there are also a bunch of other things that you have to keep in mind when doing VNs. So I'll talk about the art. So there are three terms I have here: sprites, CG, and VG. So I think probably everyone knows what a sprite is. It's just like the character asset thing, and a BG just like the background art. But so here's a screenshot where I will show you what each thing is. So the background back there, the characters are the sprites, character sprites to be specific. And here's like the GUI, which I will talk about later, I guess. And then CGs. So I think CG is like a term that probably doesn't really make sense to non-Japanese people because it's like a form of like wasei eigo, which just means when Japanese people take English words and then they're like, okay, it sounds cool. CG, computer graphic. It means like the special full picture-ish things that show up when you have like a special scene that goes on in the story. Yeah, I think these things also like show up in RPGs, but I don't really play that many RPGs. So sprites, background, and CG are the main art assets that you have to keep in mind for a visual novel. And of course, when it comes to CGs, they naturally will be like the more work heavy and expensive parts. So they tend to be used for like major scenes such as like character introductions, like when the romance pans out, like when they have the like sexy times and that type of stuff. So yeah, the art stuff. And then the GUI. So as usual, as you may expect, is like default stuff like the main menu, the preferences menus, like the save file stuff. But when it comes to how the story is conveyed in visual novels, although is kind of like basic text box at the bottom thing, which is referred to as ADV mode by a lot of people, or adventure mode. There's also a bunch of like different styles of showing off the story and like the text and stuff like that. So like when you're implementing, it's you're not really implementing it yourself. It's like part of the engine usually. So when you're like choosing what to do, when it comes to like games that use visual novel modes as like a storytelling thing, like such as Arts or whatever, or even like Disgaea, which was showed earlier. I don't even know how to pronounce that game. It's usually ADV mode because it puts like a higher focus on the art and like whatever else is going on in the background, while like keeping the text pretty sparse. Because yeah, it's like not really for people who are trying to read a whole ass novel. But another common mode is NVL mode, which is for people who are trying to basically read and write a whole ass novel, because it like literally stands for novel mode. So here's Fate saying it again, but with NVL mode, which is kind of like also another default setting that you'll find in most visual novel engines, there's like a greater focus on the writing and less on the art. And so while Fate has pretty nice art, so it's okay, like whatever, it would be fine in like NBL mode and E mode. Like some other games literally just decide not to put any like character sprites because they don't have the budget in the background and use NVL mode in order to like tell their visual novel. And also there are games that just have really shitty art that decide to use NVL mode, so then like the focus is not on the shitty art and more on the writing and storytelling. But of course, there are also other styles which I probably would not recommend for like beginners because they cost a lot. So when you look at this, you're probably thinking, looks like a comic page, right? But it turned out that this is actually a screenshot from a visual novel by the name of Quartet, like 2 to 10 hours or whatever. So if you look in the bottom right corner, you can actually see like kind of the little parts of the GUI with like the auto clipping system. But there are some visual novels that decide to use like this comic type presentation. Would not recommend because we are all broke college students here and we don't have the money to do this type of stuff. But it's pretty cool. And there are also visual novels that go for like the kind of in between of this, between the having like sprites standing there without having to draw like literally like manga panels, and also having like the speech bubbles seem more comic-y. But again, would only recommend if you're like good at coding and stuff like that, because of course this type of thing is not usually built into the engines, so you would have to kind of like code in the positioning of the bubbles and stuff like that yourself. But yeah, here are some presentation styles of how like the text box GUI goes. Oh yeah, and also of course there are mobile visual novels that's a Mystic Messenger, but it's basically just like the typical VN thing, but vertical. Since if you're making it for mobile, like please make sure that your mobile players can read it, because like people will not be wanting to read the story if they like have to strain their eyes to look at tiny text on a horizontal screen. Yep. So what's next? Well, there's music and gameplay left. And as far as music goes, I think like visual novel music kind of is the same as other game music, so I will gloss over that as in like basically not talk about it. And with gameplay, well, that's basically up to the developer. For example, visual novel RPGs are pretty common hybrids, and a game called Symphonic Pain, since it's a music-based game, literally puts a rhythm game inside the game and so on. But it's basically like up to the developer if they want to add gameplay or not. And a lot of VN people don't even expect gameplay to be in their visual novels. So no worries if you are a visual novel person like me who just wants to write the story and do the art and stuff like that, and does not add any gameplay at all. Hurrah! I know a lot of people can't draw or cannot do music. Like I can't do music either. But the good thing is, like this is for making games in general, but y'all should use Creative Commons assets, please. Like, don't be like, oh no, I have this idea, but I have to shell out $800 to get this artist to draw me stuff. Like, yes, if you want to make something great that has custom art, that's great. But before you get there, like, start with the Creative Commons stuff so you can have placeholders and whatever. Some nice places that you can find Creative Commons assets, like music, like the Leo Lloyd guy or whatever, and like the Eric dude. Like these people are extremely overused, but they have very, very big libraries of CC music. So would recommend you check them out. And for visual novels specifically, there's like a guy named Uncle Mugen who makes a lot of nice VN backgrounds. So would also recommend you check him out. And as for other stuff, well, there's a kind of deadish forum called Lemasoft, but their CC subforum still has like a lot of nice assets like sprites, BGs, music, and whatnot. And of course, if you're looking at the right tags under it, you'll find out like a lot of GUI stuff and other like art assets. So yes, please use CC assets. And this is getting kind of long, and my throat is kind of getting dry, so I'll take a drink. So now that I've introduced like the basic parts of a visual novel, I'll just like go through some engines you might be using if you're making VN. So first is RenPy, which is the thing I use. It's Python based, like basically a Pygame derivative or like that. And well, unfortunately for people who like drag and click, it's like more of the you have to type it out thing, the easy scripting language type thing. But it's very easy to get into, and it's also free, which is very good because we don't have any money here. So sad for college students. And another good thing about RenPy is that it's very easy to contact the developers, and it's still being in development. And I think the newest release that's going to be released soon, or maybe has been released, has like implemented like some shader stuff. I'm low tech, so I don't really know about the specifics of that. But yeah, RenPy good. And for Unity people, there's also something called Unity Novel. It's like a Unity plugin, and the developer is also pretty easy to contact. It costs money, like, and as I said, game stuff when it costs money, it costs like a lot. I think it's like 150 bucks. So would not recommend it unless you're like really into it or whatever. But I think there's a free demo, so if you're interested in it, like, and you have the extra time, then do check it out. Additionally, there's like a bunch of other engines out there, and I listed them. So QK and Scripter are like the classics. They're in Japanese. I don't think there are English translations. If you're interested, you could like Google them. They're like the ones that games like Tsukihime Fate Stay Night are made in. But yeah, probably would not recommend unless you're like fluent in Japanese or whatever. And they're also kind of like older engines. For some other ones, I think are Tyranno Builder, Visual Novel Maker, and Cloud Novel. So with Tyranno Builder, it also has like the same problem of not really being fully in English. But it's nice that it supports like kind of like web games, which is I guess nice, even though you could technically also do it in RenPy. And Visual Novel Maker, I think it's like more like GUI based. So for people who literally just don't want to code anything, I think it should be nice. But I've heard that's kind of buggy. I think it's also by like the people who made RPG Maker. Also, it costs money, and we're all broke here, so I don't know about that. Finally, there's like Cloud Novel, which is a web-based VN Maker thing. But unfortunately, like the developer kind of has personality problems, so I also would not recommend that. But if you're like interested in trying it out, like doesn't hurt, I guess. Hurrah! So that's about it. And well, if you're interested in making VNs and getting to know other VN people, like I can link the RenPy Discord and the DevTalk Discord. DevTalk is like kind of like a friendly community of VN makers and other people who are interested in visual novels. So yeah, and also I will still a jam that one of the Dead Talk people is doing, the Winter Visual Novel Jam, which goes on from December 1st to January 1st. They recently had October, like September through October Halloween Jam, where you can actually earn money for like the prizes. But well, that's over with. And unfortunately, this one, I mean, like not really unfortunately, but this one, no prizes, just there for the fun. And unfortunately, it's kind of during finals, so don't know if you're interested in that. But yeah, any questions? If people are still here.